Old Hollywood sold a dream so bright that audiences rarely looked at the shadows behind it. The screen glowed with courage, charm, and elegance, but off-camera, power often twisted into something colder. The same men who played heroes sometimes ruled through fear, humiliation, and cruelty. Studios protected reputations, publicists polished images, and fans applauded without ever knowing what happened when the cameras stopped rolling. Behind closed doors, tempers exploded, careers were destroyed, and personal lives unraveled. This wasn't just gossip whispered in dressing rooms. It was a pattern, repeated across decades, hidden beneath tuxedos, cowboy hats, and golden smiles. The biggest jerks in old Hollywood were not always the loudest, but they left the deepest scars, shaping an industry where talent could be overshadowed by ego, and kindness often felt like weakness, some projected strength while quietly spreading division. They played noble men on screen, yet spoke in ways that revealed a harsher worldview, one that influenced colleagues and helped fuel blacklists that ended livelihoods overnight. Meetings became interrogations, friendships dissolved under pressure, and writers found themselves forced into exile. A single powerful voice could shut doors across the industry, and those who refused to cooperate paid with their careers. Publicly, these figures remained icons, symbols of American values, while privately they wielded influence like a weapon. The contrast between the hero on screen and the enforcer behind the scenes created a chilling contradiction, one that many only understood years later. Others hid cruelty behind warmth. The gentle crooner, the comforting father figure, the man who sang about family and holidays. Behind that voice, some households lived in fear. Discipline crossed into violence, and childhood became battlegrounds. Belts, harsh words, and emotional control replaced the harmony heard on radio broadcasts. The children of these icons grew up carrying invisible wounds, struggling with addiction, depression, and broken relationships. The public heard lullabies, the families heard anger. Decades later, memoirs and interviews revealed a reality that shattered the illusion. The same voice that soothed millions had echoed through homes with commands and punishment. Then there were those whose ambition consumed everything. Directors who demanded perfection sometimes crossed the line into psychological torment. Promises were broken, boundaries ignored, and performers pushed beyond exhaustion. Scenes meant to create suspense became real sources of fear. Control extended beyond the set. Contracts locked actors into silence, opportunities vanished, and resistance meant retaliation. The power imbalance was absolute. For some, success required enduring humiliation, isolation, or intimidation. What looked like genius on screen sometimes came from an atmosphere of anxiety and manipulation. Studio bosses, meanwhile, turned Hollywood into a kingdom. They controlled contracts, appearances, and personal lives. They reshaped identities, changed names, dictated romances, and punished defiance. Stars were treated like investments, not people. One decision could erase years of work. Surveillance, intimidation, and calculated humiliation kept everyone in line. Employees whispered, actors complied, and the machine kept running. The glamour of premieres masked the fear of losing everything. Even the biggest stars knew they were replaceable. Violence also lingered in public spaces. Nightclubs, hotel suites, and parties became stages for rage. Fists flew, insults were hurled, and reputations quietly repaired afterward by lawyers and settlements. These incidents rarely damaged careers. Fame acted like armor. The public image remained intact, polished again and again. Fans saw elegance, insiders saw volatility. Some even bragged about their outbursts, turning aggression into legend. It reinforced a culture where bad behavior was tolerated, even admired, as long as the box office stayed strong. What makes these stories unsettling is not just the cruelty, but the silence that surrounded it. Colleagues looked away, studios buried scandals, and audiences remained unaware. Hollywood's golden age was built on extraordinary talent, but also on unchecked power. For every iconic performance, there were moments of fear off-screen. For every beloved figure, there were people who experienced a very different side. The biggest jerks in old Hollywood were not simply difficult personalities. They shaped an environment where intimidation thrived and empathy often disappeared to in the end. The glamour never fully erased the damage. Careers ended, families fractured, and reputations slowly shifted as the truth surfaced. The myths faded, replaced by more complicated portraits. These figures remain part of cinematic history, but their legacy carries both brilliance and shadow. Old Hollywood gave the world unforgettable entertainment, yet behind the applause were stories that remind us how power, fame, and ego can distort even the brightest spotlight. And when the camera stopped, the silence often spoke louder than the cheers. Old Hollywood sold a dream so powerful that audiences believed the people on screen were just as noble in real life. The cowboy defended justice, the crooner comforted families, the director shaped art, and the studio head built legends. But behind that carefully constructed illusion, another reality existed, one defined by ego, intimidation, and a culture where power often went unchecked. Fame acted like a shield, protecting behavior that would have ended ordinary careers. Stories circulated quietly among insiders, actors who ruled their sets like dictators, singers who brought fear into their homes, executives who treated human beings like disposable property. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of an industry that valued profit and prestige above accountability. The spotlight shone bright enough to blind the public, while in the shadows, reputations were forged through control rather than kindness. Some of the biggest personalities thrived on domination. They demanded loyalty, and when they didn't get it, they retaliated. Writers found themselves cut off from work after refusing to cooperate with political pressure. Directors used intimidation to squeeze performances out of exhausted actors. Studio bosses monitored personal lives, dictating whom stars could date, marry, or even speak to. Contract became chains. A performer could be beloved by audiences yet powerless behind the scenes. Those who pushed back risked being labeled difficult, a word that could end opportunities overnight. Fear became a silent language in the industry, understood by everyone, spoken by few. There were also the charming figures who had cruelty behind charisma. Their public image felt warm and reassuring, but off-camera their temper could turn cold and unforgiving. Families lived under strict rules. Children grew up with harsh discipline, and emotional scars formed in private. Fans heard gentle voices on radio broadcasts, unaware of the tension that existed in those homes. Decades later, when relatives spoke out, the contrast felt shocking. The comforting image collapsed, revealing that kindness on screen did not always translate to compassion in real life. It forced audiences to confront an uncomfortable truth. Talent and cruelty could coexist in the same person. Directors often wielded a different kind of power, psychological control. They pushed actors to extremes, sometimes in the name of realism, sometimes simply because they could. Promises about safety or boundaries were broken once filming began. Scenes that were meant to entertain audiences became real ordeals for performers. The imbalance of power made resistance difficult. Young actors feared losing their careers, while established stars worried about reputational damage. Silence became survival. What looked like cinematic brilliance sometimes came from environments filled with tension, manipulation, and emotional exhaustion. Studio executives turned Hollywood into a tightly controlled system. They reshaped identities, changed names, altered appearances, and built personas that could be marketed worldwide. Stars were investments, and investments had to obey. Personal freedom was limited. Relationships were arranged or discouraged. Public scandals were buried. Those who resisted faced suspension, humiliation, or quiet exile. The glamour of premieres and red carpets masked an atmosphere where everyone knew the hierarchy. At the top sat a handful of powerful figures, and below them an entire industry that adjusted its behavior to survive. Temper also spilled into public life. Parties, casinos, and hotel suites became stages for explosive confrontations. Insults were delivered in front of witnesses, furniture smashed, threats made in anger. Yet consequences rarely followed. Lawyers handled disputes, settlements were reached, and the machine moved on. Fame transformed scandal into anecdote. Some even embraced their reputation for volatility, believing it added to their mystique. It created a culture where aggression was tolerated as long as success continued. The public saw glamour. Insiders saw unpredictability. The most unsettling part of these stories is how normalized they became. Assistants learned to anticipate outbursts. Co-stars prepared for difficult personalities. Crew members whispered warnings to newcomers. Everyone adapted. The industry kept functioning, producing beloved films and unforgettable performances. But beneath the artistry, there was a cost, emotional strain, broken relationships, and careers derailed by powerful egos. The golden age of Hollywood was not just a time of creativity. It was also a time when accountability was rare and silence was common. Looking back, these figures remain complicated. They contributed to cinema in undeniable ways, yet their behavior left lasting damage. Their brilliance does not erase their cruelty, and their cruelty does not erase their impact. The biggest jerks in old Hollywood were not just difficult individuals. They were products of a system that rewarded power and overlooked empathy. Their stories remind us that behind every polished image, there can be a reality far more complicated. The lights, the applause, and the mythology created legends, but when the curtains closed, the truth often lingered in the shadows, waiting decades to be told. The shadows of old Hollywood stretched far beyond the red carpets and premiere nights, reaching into every aspect of the lives of those who worked within the studio system. Actors, directors, and producers operated in a world where power was absolute, and the consequences for defiance were swift and often devastating. Stories of intimidation, emotional manipulation, and outright cruelty were whispered from set to set, yet the public rarely knew. Legends like John Wayne and Frank Sinatra presented a veneer of charm and heroism, masking the intensity of their personal demons and the ways those demons affected others. The industry not only tolerated these behaviors, but often rewarded them, as fear and became synonymous with authority. Contracts and studio rules ensured compliance, while ambition kept talented individuals trapped in environments where their creativity was exploited and their humanity overlooked. The result was a culture where talent and terror existed side by side, and where brilliance often came at the expense of others' well-being. The system of old Hollywood was meticulously designed to maintain appearances, but behind the scenes, it was a web of manipulation, intimidation, and silent suffering. Directors pushed actors to their limits, sometimes under the guise of artistic perfection, other times out of sheer personal enjoyment of control. Studios reshaped identities, controlling how stars looked, acted, and even who they could love. Personal lives were public property, and those who questioned the hierarchy often found themselves blacklisted or humiliated. The very architecture of the studios reflected power dynamics. Private offices on elevated platforms, electronic buzzers that forced visitors to wait, and listening devices that turned every corridor into a surveillance space. Stars, despite their fame, were constantly under scrutiny, learning to navigate a world where a single misstep could destroy careers. Fear became an unspoken language, and survival depended on mastering it. Even the brightest icons were not immune to the corrosive effects of power. Talent alone could not shield actors from the personal and professional abuse that permeated the industry. Stories of abuse, whether physical, emotional, or psychological, reveal that the glamour of old Hollywood often coexisted with pervasive culture cruelty. Families of famous figures lived under strict rules and harsh punishments, while colleagues on sets endured manipulation, humiliation, and relentless pressure. Directors like Alfred Hitchcock and studio heads like Louis B. Mayer exercised control that extended far beyond professional expectations, blurring the line between authority and oppression. Performers were simultaneously celebrated and tormented, and their lives off-screen were often shaped by the whims of those who held the power. The juxtaposition of public adoration and private suffering created a dichotomy that would only later be revealed in memoirs, interviews, and biographies. The core of old Hollywood's culture of intimidation was a belief that brilliance justified cruelty. The industry prized perfection, loyalty, and marketability above human empathy, creating an environment where misconduct was not only tolerated but institutionalized. A simple outburst could be recast as eccentric genius. A violent act could be reframed as passion for one's craft. Stars learned quickly that public image and private behavior could diverge dramatically, and the ability to navigate this duality became a prerequisite for survival. The legacy of these power dynamics is complex. While the era produced unforgettable films, timeless performances, and cultural icons, it also left a trail of emotional scars and personal tragedies that haunted families, colleagues, and collaborators for decades. The price of magic on screen was often human suffering behind the camera. The stories of old Hollywood remind us that the people who shaped the golden age were complicated, often contradictory figures. They could charm millions, inspire awe, and create art that endured for generations. Yet behind the glamour lay patterns of manipulation, abuse, and fear. Their brilliance does not erase the cruelty, and their cruelty cannot diminish the impact of their contributions. Yet understanding the full scope of their behavior is crucial. To tell these stories is to confront the uncomfortable truth. Power unchecked can corrupt, and even the most iconic figures are capable of profound harm. This reality does not diminish the allure of the films and performances we cherish. Instead, it deepens our appreciation for the resilience of those who survived, the courage of those who spoke out, and the complexity of the world behind the Hollywood lights. For every legendary performance, there were untold stories of struggle and survival. Assistants, crew members, and co-stars witnessed firsthand the volatility of the industry's giants and learned to adapt quickly to their moods, their whims, and their unspoken rules. Silence became a tool of survival. Fear became a constant companion. And yet, the industry moved forward, creating masterpieces and shaping the cultural imagination of generations. These contradictions are central to understanding old Hollywood. It was a realm of extraordinary creativity and innovation, built alongside exploitation, intimidation, and emotional harm. The duality of glamour and terror, artistry and cruelty, persists in the stories that have finally emerged, offering a more nuanced and honest portrait of an era that captivated the world. Old Hollywood's facade of glamour and perfection was only the surface of a deeper, darker reality. Beneath the spotlights and the applause, the studios operated like empires built on intimidation, manipulation, and fear. Actors, directors, and executives wielded power with near-absolute authority, controlling every aspect of performers' life, from their roles and paychecks to their personal relationships and public images. The industry rewarded compliance and punished dissent, creating an environment where even the most talented could be crushed by a single word or misstep. Actors were celebrated on screen while privately enduring relentless psychological and emotional abuse, their brilliance often exploited as justification for cruelty. From blacklists to studio-mandated diets, from secret surveillance to threats of professional exile, the machinery of Hollywood ensured that power remained concentrated, and fear became a survival skill for anyone working in its orbit. This culture of fear extended beyond professional boundaries and seeped into the personal lives of those involved. Families of stars were not spared. Children were often subjected to physical and emotional punishment, forced labor, and humiliating restrictions, while spouses and partners endured coercion and abuse. The public saw only the polished images carefully curated for magazine covers and premieres, never the harsh reality behind the curtains. Directors like Alfred Hitchcock, studio heads like Louis B. Mayer, and legendary actors like John Wayne and Frank Sinatra wielded influence that shaped lives both on and off the set. They blurred the lines between personal whims and professional authority, enforcing compliance through intimidation, isolation, and sometimes outright violence. Even the brightest stars, whose work defined an era, were powerless against the invisible chains of studio control and public expectation. The stories of old Hollywood reveal a stark contradiction. The same figures who brought magic to the screen could also inflict lasting trauma. Co-stars, assistants, and family members experienced the darker side of fame firsthand. A director's push for artistic perfection could translate into physical danger for actors, while studio-imposed rules and constant surveillance ensured that no one could act freely. Public adoration masked private torment, and careers often depended on navigating a treacherous network of favoritism and fear. The psychological impact lingered for decades, shaping lives long after the cameras stopped rolling. Personal tragedies, broken families, and emotional scars were a hidden legacy of an industry obsessed with appearances and control. Old Hollywood's obsession with control and perfection also fed into systemic inequalities and abuses of power. Executives could dictate who could succeed, who could love, and who would be marginalized, often enforcing arbitrary rules rooted in bias, prejudice, or personal vendettas. Those who dared challenge the status quo faced blacklisting, professional exile, or humiliation. The combination of fame, wealth, and unaccountable authority created a breeding ground for cruelty, where fear became a tool to maintain order and obedience. The very mechanisms that produced iconic films and legendary performances were inseparable from manipulation and emotional exploitation, revealing that the glamour we remember often had a human cost hidden behind the studio walls. Even the most celebrated figures were shaped by this culture of intimidation. Some hid their volatility behind charm, while others used it to cement their power, ensuring that colleagues and subordinates knew their place. The duality of public admiration and private terror became a defining feature of the Golden Age, where brilliance could coexist with cruelty and influence often overshadowed morality. As memoirs, biographies, and investigative accounts emerged decades later, the full scope of this dark undercurrent became undeniable. These revelations force us to confront uncomfortable truths about an industry that, while producing timeless art, often did so at the expense of human dignity and well-being. The legacy of old Hollywood is therefore twofold: an era of cinematic innovation and unforgettable artistry, intertwined with stories of fear, manipulation, and abuse. It reminds us that behind the magic of the silver screen were real people navigating systems of extreme power imbalance. The lives of assistants, co-stars, family members, and even the stars themselves were shaped by a relentless pursuit of control, perfection, and public approval. Understanding this complex history allows us to appreciate not only the films and performances that endure, but also the resilience, courage, and humanity of those who survived the darker side of the dream factory.